And by being the moral leader, we must help out other countries when needed, such as genocide. So in Darfur, where we must be able to help them out when needed to make sure that all citizens are treated fairly.
Funny how Mr. Landau should refer to genocide when it was President Bill Clinton who neglected any type of genocide which was going on in Rwanda or various other African nations. I think what we have going on here is not necessarily a stance that we should cut all foreign aid. My stance in particular is that, my friends, we should cut foreign aid to nations that really don't like us very much. And we should cut foreign aid to particular nations that should learn to fend for themselves. You can always lead a horse to water, but you can't teach it to drink. You've always heard the story of the man and the fish. Teach him to fish, he'll always have food. According to the Cato Institute, instead of breaking down the cycle of poverty, foreign aid has become the opiate of the third world. Aid and other donors have encouraged third world governments to rely on handouts instead of themselves for development. No matter how irresponsible, corrupt, or oppressive a third world government may be, there is always some Western government or international agency anxious to supply it with a few more $1 million by subsidizing political irresponsibility and pernicious policies. Foreign aid ill serves the world's poor. This is an independent agency, the Cato Institute, which functions as a think tank in Washington, D.C. to describe some of the ills going on in the country. It's not a Republican machine. Talk about governments that don't like us very much and we already give them foreign aid. The Mexican government recently rejected a proposed $300 million building venture with the Chrysler Corporation because the deal might have endangered the government's control of the Mexican automotive industry. This is after we gave them $25 million.
Thank you, Paul. Matt, 30 seconds.
You know, Mr. Paul, for you to possibly say that we should not give foreign aid to countries whose governments don't like us is one of the most absurd arguments I've ever heard. That the fundamental point of foreign aid is to help the people, not to help the government in there. And you are being now confused over the people who live in that country and the government that may not like us. Now, with regards to Mexico, you don't help Mexico out, that's going to get to us. That by giving foreign aid to Mexico helps the United States of America with drug trade.
Thank you very much. This is the final question of this segment, which will be followed by closing statements, I'll remind you. This is directed initially to Paul. Paul, for roughly 50 years after World War II, nuclear weapons were limited to 5 traditional powers: the United States, the Soviet Union, China, France, and the United Kingdom. In the last 15 to 20 years, however, in particular at an accelerated rate, nuclear weapons have spread to several countries, including countries of uncertain security and stability: South Africa, Pakistan and India, Israel, former Soviet republics, possibly Iran, and perhaps most worrisomely, North Korea. Matter of fact, I'm even remembering right now they may have some in Brazil and Argentina now as well. How should security policy adapt to this emerging security state where the nuclear genie is out of the bottle? What can the United States do to prevent a localized nuclear war between these powers, or is that inevitable?
I do not believe it's inevitable, and what I would like to refer to is back to the 1970s, and while I didn't agree with a lot of Richard Nixon's policies, we did adopt one. It was called MAD, Mutually Assured Destruction. And while a lot of these regimes that you speak of may be totalitarian, may not be friendly to the American government, nobody wants a nuclear holocaust. Nobody. Even North Korea is cognizant of the fact that if they shoot off a missile, they will be dealing with China. Even more so, they will be dealing with Japan, which while they do not have an active army, you could almost guarantee that if they wanted a nuclear bomb, they could build it in a day. The only government that I am worried about right now, that we are almost certain has nuclear power, is Iran. And every time the situation of Iran is raised, my opponent shies away from it. He shies away from it because he realizes just how dangerous the Iranian government and its nuclear proliferation program can be. My opponent and his candidate would sit down with President Ahmadinejad without preconditions. They do not necessarily talk about the Islamo-fascist theocracy that controls that region. And what is most scary about Iran is that unlike other governments which may adopt a policy of mad, mutually assured destruction, the Iranians believe that if they shoot off a nuclear weapon, they will be dying for Mohammed's sake. This is a government which we must deal with very carefully, and that the UN Security Council must tread very thin. We have to realize that if we do not continue to implement more sanctions on Iran, if we do not threaten them wholeheartedly with military force, and I'm going to stand behind this, military force, Iran is a ticking time bomb, and I think my opponent realizes that. Iran is very dangerous to the world, and the last thing we need is a nuclear holocaust. So while nuclear proliferation is ongoing in other nations, Professor, the fact of the matter is that they don't want a nuclear holocaust. But I do think we need to specifically focus on the Iranian government.
Thank you, Paul. 90 seconds to Matt.
Well, I will talk about Iran directly.
Great.
The most dangerous thing for Iran is for Iran to have a nuclear weapon. Paul is right on this one. And the most important reason for that is because of the state of Israel. That we must make sure that we defend the state of Israel, and that the worst thing for Israel is for Iran to have a nuclear weapon. We also must make sure, as Mr. Liggieri stated, we don't disagree a lot on this. We know that there cannot be nuclear weapons in the world, or at the least amount possible. But we must also remember that for the United States to go into other countries and say, you cannot have a nuclear weapon, that we must be willing to remove ours as well if everybody else removes theirs. That we cannot be so arrogant to think that we can be the only country to have nuclear weapons and where nobody else can.
30 seconds, Paul.
Thank you. But I think to expound upon that particular notion, we must further analyze the absolute ideology of what Iran has. And in proportion to a senator who has not even served out a full term, less than 6 years, I would prefer the candidate. And now listen, you know what, I'm going to talk straight to you. You don't necessarily have to prefer all of John McCain's policies. But when it comes to foreign aid, at least recognize the fact that this is a man who fought for this country, became a POW of war, and stood even when he knew he was in the face of danger. This is a man who has been on the ground to Iraq, Afghanistan, and Iran, unlike President, Freudian slip, huh? Unlike presidential candidate Barack Obama.
Okay, we are at the stage where we're going to have closing statements. Frankly, I'm a little lost who's supposed to go first. Matt started, so will Matt start again?